Hebrews differed between the Palestinian was that they could not own land. So how could they be part of a scenario that does own land and controls land when they
because
only got land by inheritance?
I'll answer that two ways. One, first of all, if you read my flyer, and/or I think I wrote it in the email that I sent out, that Vivian sent out, one of the things I said is leave your beliefs at the door, okay? So we're going to have a suspension of disbelief as we go through this, because we have all been indoctrinated and inculcated in things that we believe to be real, almost all of which is not. Okay, so when I talk about belief systems, I'm talking about the fundamentals of every religion,
Right.
Judeo-Christian construct, all the way up to our New Age belief systems, our UFO belief systems, the belief that we're going to ascend or rapture or be picked up by UFOs and we're going to be saved, okay? So let me present everything I'm presenting, and we'll, at the end tomorrow we can discuss relative elements, but we're all operating under relative burdens of illusion,
Right.
okay, and beliefs, and even if we think we're enlightened, we're not very much, okay? We've all been, to put it bluntly, mind-fucked,
Yes.
okay?
That's great.
To put it blunt, okay? You know where the word fuck comes from, by the way?
No.
Huh?
Yes, why don't you tell us?
Okay. You know that when I ask the question, I'm going to tell you. Okay. Around, I think in the 1200s, there was a king. I don't know which one, maybe Richard III, somewhere along the line.
Yes. No.
And he needed some extra revenue, because kings usually do, right? So he decided that there was a good way to gather revenue, because his aristocracy and his nobility men were always out on the street at night fraternizing with the ladies of the night. So he decided, as kings will do, to lay a tax on that, okay? That's how kings and governments gain money, is taxation of the people for whatever they do, okay? And that taxation was called fornication under consent of the king. It's called a fuck tax.
Fornication under the consent of, oh, that is so beautiful.
That is so beautiful. Don't take that out.
You can remember it. And just since we're on this subject, remember what I said in the beginning. We have words and we think, well, these are the way they've always been. Well, they come from somewhere. Okay.
Wow.
Okay. Do you know where the word shit comes from? Okay. Okay. So, right, because they would carry dried manure in the boats, and if they got wet, they would start producing methane, and sometimes they'd blow the ship up. So they had to store them high in transit so that they didn't get wet. So back to Akhenaten, okay? Speaking of words and language, in terms of etymology and roots of words, there are syllable sound tone constructs that are the building blocks of words, okay? In Egypt and Sumer, any syllable basically has those components in it. Ankh, of course, we know is that symbol of life, referred to life, the Ankh. Na is a Sumerian word that was also used in Egyptian, and it basically means the link or the bridge. Aten was the name of the monotheistic god, sometimes referred to as Atan. Okay. So basically, it's the link between, or the bridge between life and God, okay? But as many things, such as the word jurisdiction, the word of the law, but underneath that, juris means oath, the binding to the word of the law, or the binding to that jurisdiction of law. There's another definition for Akhenaten, which is basically the eye of Atan, okay? The all-seeing eye, okay? Now, a little later, we're going to get into a little bit of construction of language and letters some more, but our letter A comes from this. Did you ever see that before? Well, what I'm trying to give you today and tomorrow is to start building your decoder ring, okay? To start seeing behind the surface image and see how the pieces fit together. I didn't find this in any book. I just started looking at, that's interesting. The letter A obviously is a truncation of a pentagram. It is also obviously a pyramid on top of two legs.
Or A is alpha, which is 1.
Right, well, of course. So it's a link between life, or the human earthly dwelling, bridge to that monotheistic concept of God, because prior to the institution in Akhenaten's time of the cult of Atan, you had, of course, Amen, who was known as Amen-Ra. The word Amen means hidden, okay? Before he, the sun god, became hidden, he was known as Marduk-Ra, or just Ra, and basically he was the arch, the sun god, behind whom stood and remained Anu, the solar principle, or the construct of that solar principle, okay? Who we will come to find and know as our true puppet master, okay, who wears many masks and has many faces. But Akhenaten was instituting all of this, the first true monotheistic structure during this period, around 1350, 1400 BC. Now, one may ask, where did they get all this information? Where did the template start from? You talk about alpha, we've heard of alpha and omega, and the beginning was the end already, and so forth. Well, imagine the structure of what we are literally living today, that we have created, okay, was a template overlaid on the hologram of the perceived reality, that which was seen, not that which was unseen, okay? That from the beginning of this whole time-space contract, the end product was already in place and designed. So imagine if I were to take a linear line and call that time, and call this, 2012, and call this wherever we want. Let's just say 13,000 years ago, okay? But this is only one linear construct. 13,000 years is half of a grand solar year. Those of you familiar with time cycles, astrology, astronomy, and so forth know that we rotate around a central sun every 26,000 years. We also have something called the precession of the equinox, which is the wobble of the North Pole. That is approximately the same period of time. So we have a time cycle of 26,000 years. We have much larger time cycles. The Mayans charted those time cycles. Their entire so-called calendar wasn't about 7 days a week or 12 months of the year. It was about all the interlocking wheels of time and space. They actually had 17 calendars. This date was the completion of a 26,000 year cycle. And everybody has been, in the popularization of 2012, trained to believe all these different things. It's the rapture, it's the return of Christ, it's the ascension, it's all these things. All it is a completion of the arrival to the end point of a template that was designed to be and structured to be our outpicturing of our own prison. The prison was already designed and in place. So where did all these guys, who we called the Illuminati, the elite, and all the rest of it, where did they get their juice? Okay, because they weren't given a manual and say, well, do this and go here and do this and whatever. They just did what they were impelled to do, whether they were taking psilocybin mushrooms or they were doing different things to access the realm of the gods. Okay. What they were doing was, in this period of time, they were creating what we have called mana. Okay? You know what mana is?
Yeah. Well,
No, you don't. Okay? You break it down into the Egyptian Sumerian words. Here we have An, always in the middle. Or sometimes reverse. We have Na, the bridge. The bridge to An, or Anu. The one standing behind the hidden one. Okay? Shem can be translated as the high word firestone. Not to be confused with Firestone tires. Or the Shem bread, or the conical bread. Different things. If you look through this book, the Egyptian Book of the Dead and other things, you will often see one individual holding a conical shape of something, handing it to somebody else. Okay? Because they made the mana, or the Shem on Na, by taking gold and doing certain things to it and creating what we call today monoatomic gold, or orbitally rearranged monoatomic elements. Orme. Do a search on that word, or ormus. Monoatomically, orbitally rearranged. The electron orbital outer shell is rearranged by doing certain things with heat and temperature and otherwise, and breaking the atomic or the molecular bonds and ending up with a white powder that, based on how it was constructed to arrive at that, came out as a conical shape, because that was the crucible that it was put in. Okay? So like when Moses, the story of Moses says that he was up on the mountain talking to God with all the fires of God belching and smoking and everything. What he was doing was he was up in his laboratory cooking up the good stuff. Okay? And he came down, it's the ancient variation of the meth lab, but they had more purpose and focus of it than guys just getting stoned on methadone. Okay? And he came down, he saw the people worshiping the golden calf, and he took it and he turned it into a powder. Okay? And he fed it to the people. Right? Okay? He was creating the Shem on Na, the highward waystone, or the philosopher's stone, that would create the bridge to go to Anu. Okay, now Anu is the sun god, Ra is the sun god, Amun-Ra is the sun god. There's an orbit of the sun, as we know. An orbit of the earth around the sun. That was called, in Egypt, a Shah. And of course, Ra is right in there. And it took you, if you consumed monoatomic gold, to something called An. An is the Egyptian word for light. Okay? An was the name of the city in the Nile Delta region. Are we okay on recording everything? Okay. On was known as the city of light. Eventually it became known in the Greek period as Heliopolis, the city of the sun. And eventually it became known as Alexandria. Okay? So taking the mana, or the Shem on Na, the Highward Waystone that was produced in laboratory conditions to create monoatomic gold, to lift the consciousness to a plane of reality, or the plane of On, in relationship to Ra, or the solar logos, or the solar orbital sun, took you to the plains of Charon. Okay? See where that comes from?
Yes.
Okay, so you've heard the rose of Charon?
No.
Okay, you've heard of the term Rosicrucis?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, Rosicrucis, Rosicrucians?
Yes.
Well, it doesn't mean a rose. Okay, this is the color, and we've also heard of the term the phoenix, right? Need an E in there. The rise of the phoenix from the ashes. Well, crucis means crucible, or the conical shaped cone in which this would form when they would cook the good stuff and create the Shemana, or the mana, so that the high priesthood can consume it and be raised to the plains of Charon, so that they could access the light of Anu and basically accessed, I didn't finish the timeline thing. Let's say here's the entire template out of time and space of today's complete lockdown of the entire human race, planet, structure, the whole thing that we're manifesting almost completely today. It's always there, it's complete. The Alpha and the Omega are known at the same time. It's got nothing to do with Jesus being the Alpha and Omega and all that interesting stuff. What it has to do with is if you're on the timeline here 13,000 years ago, 8,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago, et cetera, and you know how to access the plains of Charon by taking the mana, so that you can get your current piece of the structure and download it and manifest it, that is your conspiracy, if you will, of how to create a global prison. Okay? Because all the debunkers of conspiracy theorists say, well, so what are you telling me? All these guys get together every day and they, whatever? No. They were accessing through the Rosicrucis, which was a crucible, and this was the color of when they were applied the proper heat, temperature, pressure to the gold of the color phoenix. The Egyptian word phoenix means basically crimson, okay? Crimson purple. It was the color that they would achieve. They would achieve the phoenix, they would create the ashes, and it would rise out of the ashes to create the mana, so that they could consume it, so that they could go up to the plains of Charon and go up and access the template of the construct of how they were going to build the prison. Okay? Creating the money system, the law system, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
So,
Just make sense?
yes.
To them, I guess.
No, it should make sense to us too, because we see it, but we haven't quite understood and seen the complete picture of it. Okay?
So then, if I understand this correctly, so then these people in history who sometimes are portrayed as being special or gifted or what have you, it may not be so, they just happen to have this, they knew how to get to that place.
Well, there's two elements. There are those who are born into specific families and bloodlines and initiatory structures to be taken through the process to be able to do all of this.
But they were
Okay.
taught that, so it's just like
Well, yeah. So,
having the knowledge to teach you how to do something.
so
Versus someone.
So let's go back to that, and let's go back to Egypt. We have, in Egypt, before the consolidation by Akhenaten and his team, and if you read Michael Tessarian's work, what you will see is that all of the players the Jesus, the Mary, the Joseph of Arimathea, the Lazarus, all these different players, they were all part of that group at that time. And they basically formulated how? By going up to the plain of Sharon and starting downloading, okay, this is where we're going to go, and start constructing this Judeo-Christian construct of monotheistic control through religion and binding of law and the temples and the banking and everything else, and who's going to be who. Well, Akhenaten basically, one of, if you look at the name of many of the pharaohs, they have different names. They all had meanings, like Akhenaten, you know, the bridge to On, etc. What I went through. There's another one named Tutmosis. I forget all the names, but the tags like Hotep, Amenhotep, and and Aten. You'll see the names of the pharaohs all had these basic tags. Who was their principal god, okay, or their principal alignment and what have you. So the word Moses had various meanings, one of which was he who was born from the waters, he who was the servant of Tut or Toth, and so forth. So Akhenaten also was known as Moses. He was a Moses, okay? All of these names, Mary, Moses, Joseph, Abram, they're all basically Egyptian words, you know. Remember I talked about the god. I didn't talk much about, in fact, I don't think I talked about that. I talked about the Iberu and Ari. Well, the other side of it was that in Ireland they had various names for that ephemeral or, you know, ineffable principle of that which was above us, was known as Isu or Essa, you know. And of course, J was another article, just like H. H was Ari, the Ari. It's where we get our modern name of Harry, okay. J or an H type, you know, H and J are similar sounding, basically means the Esu, the essence of, the ineffable quality of who we are as a totality of a human spiritual union, what have you. You know, so, and of course, you know, there's Jesus. You know, when Poseidon wanted to, you know, play with his older brother, hey Zeus, you want to come swim? You know, you know, these names, these titles were known and used thousands and thousands of years by any of these players. Okay, and then remember we had the Ili, out of which that principal first syllable, Il, and we have the name El, various variations on that. We ended up with this, the high one, you know, the Il or the Ili were known as the high one or the elevated one. So we get that word Elit, the elevated one. Get the word elevator, to lift up. We get the word elector, you know, which is known as a prince of the realm. Why a prince of the realm? Why an elector? Because the prince of the realm held the land by dispensation of the king who controls the land. So the prince or the crown prince would be a qualified elector, because only an elector had the capacity and the authority to hold the land and elect those who would be representative of the king's authority. Okay? So then we get names for the gods, Elohim, or El Elyon, which eventually we could do as Ilion. We put a W there and add an M, we get the name William. Okay? So who do we have now as the crown princes and the, you know, the heir apparent to the crown?
Yes, Harry and
We have Harry and William.
Yes.
This is the origin of it. Okay?
Zion backwards and you got Illinois.
Now don't be annoying. Okay, but back there, around that time of Akhenaten, consolidating the pantheon of many gods and many temples and many lines of religion, we have what is essentially our first modern corporate merger, because you had the sun cult, the moon cult, and the stellar cult. Those are the three. Remember, we talked about the arch and the sun, but the moon was the other factor of it. There's another creation story in the Book of the Dead and Egyptian creation, talking about Isis playing a trick, so to speak, on Ra and getting some of his substance. I learned that just a couple weeks ago reading this book, drugging him, and then he dribbled out of his mouth while he was sleeping, and she took that substance, his life force, and formulated it into something that then attacked him, like in the form of a serpent, killed him, or was, it hurt him, potentially could debilitate him. And the antidote was that she forced him to give her his name. Okay? What do we have in modern times when they capture us, they capture our straw man when they take us into their ship to control our vessel and to board it in their so-called courtrooms to gain control of our capacitance to charge and discharge. They get our name, okay? So that is where our power is, because behind the word is the resonance of who we are, because sound precedes light. Light is nothing more than the overlay on who we really are as resonance, pure sound, because when sound resonance interacts with itself, it creates friction, which creates light. Okay? So the capture of Anu, of who we really are as pure resonance, and utilizing us by overlaying all of what I'm discussing and describing to create that polarization, the schisming of the masculine, the dominance of the feminine, is to create that illusion of light. And what is ubiquitous in all of our religions and our New Age stuff and everything in between, it's always about going to the light. Anybody heard of somebody named Robert Morningstar or Morning Sky? Look up his name, do a Google on it. He's from the Apache, Hopi, Navajo nations, and I heard him speak about 13 years ago, and he talks about, and remember what that region is, the Four Corners, and we're going to get into that later as well. And he talked about the knowledge that was passed on through their traditions and their knowledge of what was really going on. And the first thing they taught the kids, if you die, do not go to the light. It's a reprocessing center. Okay? Yeah. Now pick your jaw up off the ground and reconnect it.
Oh, yeah.
I told you to leave your belief systems at the door. All of this stuff about we want to be the light, Jesus is the light, we want to go to the light, is another part of the construct of control. Okay, and we're going to get into that. Why? Because what is that plane of On or Chevron, okay, is the light. Okay. Later we're going to talk about the split between heaven and earth as part of the master polarization. Okay. Remember when I talked here a few weeks ago, I said a couple of key things. One being that if you look objectively and dispassionately without that urge to want to, achieve spiritual awareness or enlightenment or any of that kind of stuff, and you just look at the facts of essentially another part of the decoder ring is whatever they tell us, have told us over thousands of years, don't go there, go over here. Okay. So it's always about go over here. Well, that's where they control us. So all traditions talk about go to the light, go to the light. Okay. The light in heaven, and by the way, heaven has been canceled. The light in heaven is where you go.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yes.
There's two control mechanisms that were set up to control us, whether in body or out. When we're out of body, we're in this construct, artificial construct called heaven, and when we're in body, we're in this construct called, New World Order, totalitarian, fascist control. In heaven, it was the white light. On earth, it's essentially the money system. Okay, those are the two gods. Go to this God when you're out of body, go to this God when you're in body. Okay? We'll get to all that later. Okay? So, back to Akhenaten. Oh, I know where I left off. I was trying to think where I left off. So there were various cults, belief systems, temples, systems, etc. The primary ones were the solar, the lunar, and the stellar. The lunar, the principal goddess was Isis. Okay? The solar principal god was Amun-Ra. And the stellar, the principal god, was actually El-Elyon. See anything in there? Okay. Israel. Okay, so when Akhenaten consolidated the monotheistic principle as Moses, because when he got kicked out of Egypt after a 17-year reign, he brought together those parts of the Aparu, the outcast, the Hyksos, the control team, who were going to then structure a control template for the next 3,000 to 3,500 years that they kept accessing through Sha'ra'on, or in taking the mana to get to that plane of awareness of the template of Anu's structure or prison that had been designed since the beginning of time to trap us into by our own creation, our own consent to contract, jurisdiction, and religion at the end of time, which is about 17 months away. He formed the corporate merger consolidation of the lunar, solar, and stellar cults and created Israel. And the whole game plan was, at the end of time, we will all meet again in Israel and merge the line of the king and the priest in the Isis-Osiris mystery cult of Sion or Zion. This is what Zionism is coming back to the end of time, which we're in. Doesn't mean the end of the world, just the end of the artificial construct in our mind, in Israel, to bring back the original Egyptian solar, lunar, and stellar cults. And it's everywhere, okay? Now, remember, let's go back to the Isis-Osiris story when Isis put together Osiris and found that he had been dismembered. She created an artificial phallus and impregnated herself. And she birthed the rising sun, who was dead and rose again, Osiris, Horus, the transmutation of the Father into the Son. And Horus was born, and Horus had two eyes. Well, we all have two eyes. But Horus established something called the mystery school of the left eye of Horus and the right eye of Horus. Well, back to that story of Isis gathering the spittle of Ra, who was now hidden. He was Marduk Ra, now he was Amun Ra. And gathering the spittle and using that to to attack and poison Ra and get him to give her his name. The result of that story was that the two orbs of Ra's eyes would now be vested, so to speak, into Horus. The sun and the moon became the elements of the control template of that artificial construct of the prodigal or the rising sun, the horizon, and integrating the solar knowledge and the lunar knowledge. And the mystery schools or the esoteric schools of the Egyptian system, which has followed us for the last 5,000 years, was basically taking those two split, polarized parts of the masculine as symbolically, energetically, metaphorically represented by the two pillars, and the initiates, whether through earning an ability to enter into initiatory processes or through bloodlines and all of the rest of that, would walk the left eye of Horus and then walk the right eye of Horus. And when they finished those two schools, which took at least 24 years, 12 years each, they would have been taught how to integrate back to the capacity to see wholeness. They would be able to elevate or rise above the hologram or the containment field in which all the population would be put into to control their creator capacity and their capacitance to outpicture and create this reality of that template of that prison planet lockdown that is at the end of time. So we are split. We don't think in whole, okay? The elite and the initiates are taught to not have to be under that encumbrance, okay? They would go through initiatory schools, they would be taught all of this, and they would be taught how to integrate their mind and be able to become a controller in the template of everything I've described. The ultimate initiation would be they would be taken to the king's chamber of the Great Pyramid, which is constructed on something called a golden mean phi ratio, okay, which I'm sure you've all heard, okay? And basically, that pyramid, and wherever that is exactly, the way the three pyramids on Giza are located and other things in that whole area are designed, would generate a phi ratio spiral, and that spiral would come right through the king's chamber. And when they first opened it up about 100 years ago, the so-called sarcophagus, which wasn't, it was actually a place for ceremony, and the initiate who was ready to be elevated to permanently into the planes of Charon to become an elite or an Illuminati, an enlightened one, an illumined one. No, hang on one second. Would be placed on there. And when they first opened it up 100 years ago, it was still in the exact place. And when they also first opened it up, the whole room was filled with white powder. Okay? Because these guys were snorting it and eating it and you name it. I'm joking. I'm sure they did it quite in a controlled manner because you had to be able to retain your integration when you were going to lie there and consume a quantity of the mana or the monoatomic gold to raise yourself to the planes of Charon and get into this exact phi ratio that would come ripping through you, and if you weren't capable of holding and retaining integration, it would blow you apart. And during the first few years when they did open the king's chamber and they allowed tourists and people to go in there, and that sarcophagus or that marble dais or what a stone structure, people would lie on it and they would come out insane, okay, because they didn't have the capacity to hold themselves, because for one, they were castrated energetically, they were not grounded. And the eyes of Horus, those mystery schools, would teach the elite, the illumined ones, how to retain that capacity and not be blown out, because they were grounded, they were remembered, right? Okay. So another part of the initiation, if you look at Egyptian history, they revered the crocodiles, And during the final ceremonies, they would take the fat of the crocodile and anoint the initiates, and that was called the Messa, out of which you get the word Messiah, which doesn't mean what we think it means today. It just simply means the illumined one who is elevated above the din of the holographic control system that they would then be creating in the next 3,000 to 5,000 years, building the template of control through the binding to the law and the lifting off of the land so that we don't have the grounding to the wealth and the source of substance in physical life and reality that they would control. Okay? So the initiate would become a Messa or a Messiah. Has nothing to do with some external guy who's coming back, to save us. And of course, later on, the Greek word for anointed or the initiated or lifted one was Christos. So that ineffable quality that one can attain by reintegrating who we really are as a true being without separation of mind and self and body, lifting up to that true level of integration and becoming a Messiah or a Christos. That's where that name comes from. And this story is modeled exactly on the Horus, or the sun rising, the horizon, prodigal son, who is birthed by reintegrating, by remembering the masculine, grounding, integrating the polarity, and being able to be anointed and lifted above the holographic reality of control. So then you look at the New Testament story. You look at the Old Testament. We're going to get into some of that in a moment. The New Testament story, what's the New Testament story? John the Baptist, the herald of the coming Messiah, is captured and is put in the prison of the king, Herod, and then they have a party, and Herod's wife has a daughter named Salome, and she dances the dance of the 7 veils. What's the dance of the 7 veils? The closing of the 7 chakras, locking us into the physical body so that we are controlled, okay? And the story goes, she did it so well by the seductive quality of the controlling feminine that will control the castrated masculine and create that sense of impotence, dominance, and rage that can be controlled to split and control the two halves of ourselves, the masculine and the feminine. She did it so well, she was given what? The head of John. Or she was given the ability to request anything she wanted, which was, she said, the head of John. Okay, so they brought it on a silver platter. But what head was that? Was it this head or was it this head? Okay, that's a symbolic metaphor of restating that when the masculine is controlled, it will be castrated, dismembered, and split. Okay, it's restated many times. For example, the story of Abraham, who was first called Abram,